Very good evening to all of you. Welcome another one webinar to this deformation mechanism and types of fracture. In this webinar, we are going to study the different types of deformation mechanisms and also how the fracture will provided in the materials, how the fracture will be created in the material, and how it will be classified. So in the before webinars, we have studied about the different types of ferrous materials, non-ferrous materials, and non-metals, etc. In this video, we are going to see the common deformation and fracture mechanism for different materials. First of all, what is deformation? So deformation means the change in shape or size in the material is known as plastic deformation. If the body is loaded beyond the elastic limit, the body will experience a change in shape and size, even if the load is removed. So the deformation will be developed in single crystals or polycrystalline materials. So in this video, we are going to see the different types of deformation mechanisms. Mainly, plastic deformation in single crystals may take place by slip, twinning, or a combination of both. So what is meant by slip? Slip is the most common mode of plastic deformation among crystals. When a single crystal in tension is stressed beyond its elastic limit, a change in shape will be provided. So that means a step appears such that the single crystal divided into two blocks. So when you apply the tensile load, so the single crystal will be divided into two blocks. So that is meant by slip. Slip occurs due to the movement of dislocations through the crystal. So in this diagram, so this is the original shape. This one is the shape which is done by the slip. So this is the original shape. So net shape change is known as slip. So the dislocation, this is the multi-crystal structures. In this structure, one block will be dislocated because of the routine tensile load. So the step will be provided which dislocates the two crystals. So this is the original shape. This one is the shape after slip. So in this diagram, two blocks will be dislocated. In the first top diagram, only one crystal block will be dislocated. But in this second diagram, because of the tensile load which will exceeds the limit, elastic limit, will create dislocation of two blocks. So this is the different types of dislocations which will be provided by means of the external tensile load. So as you know, the tensile load will create the tensile stress. So tensile means axial pull. So because of axial pull, so different shapes or different blocks will be dislocated. So these are all the different kind of dislocation done by slip. So in this figure, we can easily understand after the slip, the two blocks will be dislocated. So before slip, the crystal structures will be uniformly placed. After the application of tensile load, the slips will occur, which dislocates the exactly half of the structure. So these are all the different examples of dislocation of crystal by means of slip. So this is one engine part. This engine part will be subjected to fatigue load. So because of the repeated cycling of load, the structure of this engine part will be dislocated. So this is the best example for slip. So the moment of dislocations can be compared to the movement of an caterpillar as it arches its back in order to move forward. So this is the different dislocations by means of slip. Then the second one is twinning. So the twinning is the definite distance and in the same direction. So when a shear stress is applied, the crystals will twin about the twinning plane in such a way that the region to the left of the twinning plane is not deformed, whereas the region to the right is deformed. So in the upcoming diagram, we can easily understand the formation of twinning. So this is because of the shear load. So the mirror shape of the place will be dislocated. So this is the formation of twinning. So twinning is mainly due to the shear stress. So in this diagram, we can understand the twinning which is occurred in the face cubic crystal lattice by means of shear stress. So we can easily understand this type of structure will be subjected to shear load. After the shear load, the center position of the structure will be twinned. So the mirror image of the structure will be dislocated. So because of this one, the twinning will be created in the center position of this structure. So this diagram will differentiate slipping and twinning. So in the left diagram, this is the example of slipping, that is slip. So slip will be provided, will be created in the zigzag position, but in case of twinning, it is the twinning will occur in same direction. So this is the orientation of slipping and twinning. So center part is the original crystal. If this original crystal will be subjected to tensile load, slipping will occur by the by this dislocation. If the original structure will be subjected to shear load, the structure will be deformed like this. Now we are going to see the difference between slip and twinning. In slipping, the deformation takes place due to the sliding of atomic planes over the others. In twinning, the deformation is due to the orientation of one part of the crystal with respect to other. The second difference is it occurs along individual slip lines, but in case of twinning, it occurs over general crystallographic planes. Then the atomic movements are over large distance, but in case of twinning, the atomic movements are over a fraction of atomic space. The fourth difference is there is no change in the orientation of the atoms after slip, but in case of twinning, the twinned atoms undergo a change in their orientation and become mirror of the untwinned atoms. So, as I told, mainly when the shear stress reaches resolved crystal shear stress, there is one role for resolved crystal shear stress. So mainly the slip is due to tensile, but in twinning is due to shear. Now we are moving into second topic, that is types of fracture. So the fractures may be occurred in the ductile materials or brittle materials. As you know, the ductile materials will elongate and after taking some time, it will completely break. But in the brittle fracture, Because of its brittle nature, after applying the load, it will be directly break. No elongation will be take place. So before defining the brittle structure and ductile structure, what is mean by fracture of material? It refers to the failure of material under load by breaking into two or more pieces. Fracture can occur under all service conditions. As I told, mainly the fracture will occur ductile materials and brittle materials. Mainly the ductile materials due to extensive plastic deformation and energy absorption before fracture. But in brittle material, little plastic deformation and low energy absorption before fracture. Now, what is meant by ductile fracture? What is the cause of ductile fracture? Ductile fracture occurs with plastic deformation, brittle fracture, little or no plastic deformation. So this SEM image will indicate the ductile fracture and this SEM image will indicate brittle fracture. So ductile fracture will be elongated before the fracture, but in the brittle materials, the fracture will be immediately occur. And also, high energy is absorbed by microwave coals, coalescence due to during ductile failure, that is high energy fracture mode. Low energy is absorbed during transgranular cleavage fracture, that is low energy fracture mode. So this image will indicate the transgranular fracture and intergranular fracture. So in the brittle material, the fracture will be provided across the grain boundary, but in the ductile material, the fracture will take place around the boundaries, that is around the grain boundaries. So in case of ductile fracture, extensive plastic deformation ahead of crack, but in the brittle fracture, relatively little plastic deformation. And as I told, crack is stable in case of ductile fracture, but in the brittle, in case of brittle fracture, crack is unstable and it propagates rapidly without increase in applied stress. But in case of ductile fracture, it resists further extension unless applied stress is increased. So mainly the ductile fracture uh, is occurred due to the shear, but in the brittle fracture, cleavage is main cause of fracture. In the ductile, for example, fibrous and gray materials, the appearance is the gray color, but in the brittle fracture, its appearance is granular and bright. As I told, the crack propagation will occur along the grain boundaries in case of ductile fracture, ductile material, but in case of brittle materials, the crack propagation will be provided through the grain boundaries. So this is a stress strain diagram which will indicate the fracture mode of brittle and ductile. So in case of brittle, the fracture will be will become very short time period, but in case of ductile material, fracture will takes place more. It takes more time. So in the ductile material, first of all, it will occur the yield stress, then ultimate stress. Finally, fracture will occur in case of ductile material. So mainly, the fracture will be developed mainly due to tensile load, shear load, and cleavage, and this is the peel mode of fracture. So this is the different uh, shape of materials after fracture. So this is the first one is the example for very ductile soft material. This is the medium ductile material. This is the brittle material. So mainly cold metals and ceramics will be fractured uh, by by this mode. But ductile materials like aluminum, polymers, gases, and some metals will be deformed by means of this fracture mechanism. So this fracture is mainly called as rupture fracture. This is the cup and cone fracture. This is the brittle fracture. So because of the extensive load, these type of voids, cracks, and blowholes are also uh, provided by means because of this fracture mechanism. So first one is the example of necking. Second one is the example of formation of microvoids, and third one is the example of coalescence of microvoids to form a crack. And this fourth one is the example of crack propagation by shear formation. And final diagram will be the example of fracture. So mainly ductile fracture is undergoes three stages: formation of cavities, then growth of cavities, finally final failure. So as I told, in ductile material, the fracture will takes place more time. So first step of fracture in ductile material is formation of cavity, then growth of cavity, finally final failure of fracture material. So in the case of brittle material, the deformation will takes place in very short time, and it will be directly deformed with flat surface. So this is the SEM image after the ductile failure. So this is the ductile failure SEM image. So ductile fracture will be cup and cone fracture in aluminum. So this is the aluminum material after the fracture. So fracture will takes place in three steps. First of all, necking, then cracks, then propagation of cracks, finally failure. That is fracture. So in ductile fracture, extensive plastic deformation takes place before fracture, but in case of brittle fracture, very less plastic deformation and directly deformation will occur in case of brittle material. So this is the example of brittle fracture, that is limited dislocation mobility. So brittle fracture, three stages of brittle fractures are plastic deformation that causes dislocation, piles up and obstacles, and second stage of brittle fracture is micro crack, nucleation as a result of buildup of shear stress. Then final stage of brittle fracture is eventual crack propagation under applied stress and aided by stored elastic energy. So thus, we have studied the different fracture mechanism in case of ductile materials and brittle materials. So, as I told, the brittle material, in case of brittle material, the fracture will takes place in the around the grain along the grain boundaries. They mainly transgranular fracture and intergranular fracture will be takes place in case of brittle fracture. So this is the difference between ductile fracture and brittle fracture. Strain energy required is higher in case of ductile fracture. Strain energy required is lower in case of brittle fracture. So stress during cracking is increasing after the deformation, but in case of brittle fracture, the stress during cracking is constant. So crack propagation is slow in case of ductile fracture. Crack propagation is fast in case of brittle fracture. So these are all the different differences in between ductile fracture and brittle fracture. So ductile fracture will be occurred most metals, but in brittle fracture occur ceramics, glasses, and ice. So this is the main important deformation mechanism, which will be covered all materials and non-materials also. So thank you for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the video. Make sure you've subscribed so that you can get the regular updates. Use the feedback ink in the description to get your certificate. Thank you.